I have to tell you, I told you, I do a lot of work with photography, and that's what the kids do to me. So this is the way I have a chance to do it back. Okay.
I'm ready. Very good.
Okay. We are now sitting in a building called Beit Hadassah. Beit Hadassah, literally called the Hadassah House, was built in 1893. It served as a medical clinic for Jews in Hebron, for Jews and Arabs in Hebron for quite a number of years. Anybody that didn't have any money would be able to receive services for free. The original building was this floor down here. The entrance was from the back. The second floor was added on in 1907 or 1908, like that. And as I said, this served the community until 1929. We'll talk more about 1929 in a little while. When we were up in Tel Umeida, I gave you some of the history of our return to Hebron. And I told you how we came back in 1967 and 1968, moved to Kiryat Arba in 1971. However, as I mentioned, the goal was always to come back into Hebron proper. There were attempts made to come down here that did not succeed. 1979, then Prime Minister Menachem Begin was in the process of starting Oslo, then they called it Camp David, and that Passover, a group of families in Kiryat Arba sat down together and decided that the time had come to try again. So a week and a half after Passover let out, the beginning of May of 1979, in the middle of the night, a group of 10 women and 40 children got into a truck in Kiryat Arba, and very, very slowly and very, very quietly, they made their way down from Kiryat Arba, just like you did earlier today, down that hill into the city. And they started to come through the city, but they didn't come down through the road we drove through. They came through the back road where the Kasbah is, parallel to us in the back, and they stopped outside this building. They all got out, and very, very quietly, they put a ladder up to one of the windows in one of the back rooms, and they got the kids up, and they all climbed in. It was very dirty here. Nobody had been here for a long time. They cleaned the area a little bit. They had some brooms with them. They cleaned it a little bit, put some mattresses down. That's basically all they had with them, and they went to sleep. The next morning, they woke up. What do 40 children do the first morning back in Hebron? They start to sing. What did they sing? They sang in Hebrew a song, V'shavu banim l'gvulam, our children have come home. Now, according to the stories I've heard, there were Israeli soldiers guarding on the roof of the building at the time, and when the kids started to sing, the soldiers almost fell off the roof. Because there hadn't been anybody here the day before. And none of them believed in ghosts, but something very strange was happening. So they came down, and they find here these 10 women and the 40 children, and they say, "How did you get here?" And the children all at once say, "Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob brought us." Now, Menachem Begin, as I said, was at the moment, at that particular time, parting from the Sinai. He really didn't want to have to deal with a group of Jews in Hebron, but he didn't want to physically evict them. It's not like today. So he did the next best thing. He put the building under siege. He surrounded the building with soldiers and police and said, whoever leaves can't go back. And nobody else was allowed in. But basically his goal wasn't only to keep them from coming back in. He basically, when he said nobody could come in, he said nothing could come in. They figured a few days without food and water, and everybody would get up and leave very quickly and very quietly. So somebody went to Begin and said, look, during the 1973 Yom Kippur War, Israel surrounded the Egyptian Third Army down in Sinai. And after we surrounded them, we gave them food, water, and medical supplies. If this is what we had given the enemy that had attacked us and killed our soldiers, at the very least, you can give this to the women and children in Hebron. So Begin agreed, and he let them have food, water, and medical supplies, and that's it. And that's the way they lived here for a few months. Now, there are a lot of stories about what happened then. There was a woman when they came in here who was pregnant. And because there were no sanitary conditions, there was no running water, very quickly there was an outbreak of hepatitis. Now, hepatitis and pregnancies don't go too well together, so her friends told her she should leave. And she said, if I can't come back, I'm staying, and she stayed. And as her due date came closer and closer, they said, you've got to go to the hospital to give birth. And she said, if I can't come back, I'll give birth here. There was so much pressure on the Israeli government that finally they caved in. One afternoon, a man shows up at the front gate. They call the woman out, and he hands her a piece of paper, and she reads it. It's a permit. It says she can leave and come back. And she smiled and gave it back to the guy. And he said, "What's your problem? This is what you wanted. You can leave and give birth and come back." She said, "Yes, but it doesn't say on the permit that I can bring my baby with me." So they gave her a new permit that said she could come back with her baby. She went to the hospital, gave birth to a little girl. Of course, she named the girl Hadassah, came back to Beit Hadassah. Hadassah got married a few years ago. There was a little boy who had a toothache. And, what could they do? They sent him up to Kiryat Arba to the dentist. And when he got back to the gate outside, the security guard who was standing there said, "What do you want?" And he said, "Well, I went to the dentist. I came back." He said, "You left. You can't go back." And the little boy said, "But my imai, my mother's there." And he said, "Your mother can come out. You can't go in. You left. You can't go back." And the little boy started to cry because he wanted his imai. He wanted his mother. As this is developing, as this is unfolding, the people inside understand what's going on. They make contact with a minister in the Israeli government. Now, we're going back now a long time, 1979. I don't know how many of you were involved in Israeli politics in 1979, 1980. You probably never heard of this guy. He's since disappeared from the Israeli political scene. I always have trouble remembering his name. Sharon, Ariel Sharon. They made contact with Ariel Sharon, and he called a special session of the Israeli cabinet, and there was an Israeli cabinet discussion about the little boy standing outside at the gate, and at the end of the discussion they made a formal decision of the Israeli cabinet, of the Israeli government, to allow the little boy to come back inside. They haven't changed. In any case, the woman lived like this for about 2.5, 3 months. At that time, the siege was lifted. They were allowed to leave and come back. Nobody else was allowed in, and that's the way they lived here for an entire year. Every Friday night, when for Sabbath services, people would come from Kiryat Arba to pray in the Tomb of the Patriarchs, and when they were finished, they would then sing and dance down here. They'd line up in a big circle outside in the street here and sing and dance for the women and the children that were here, and then they would go back up to Kiryat Arba. The women had been here for a year. It was exactly 27 years ago, a few days ago. It was exactly 27 years ago. Friday night, the men had come down. They had lined up to start to dance when they were suddenly attacked by terrorists who were on the roof of a building behind them. 4 terrorists started shooting at them, throwing hand grenades. As a result of that attack, 6 men were killed, another 20 were wounded. A few days later, the Israeli government, the cabinet, again meeting in special session, finally authorized the renewal of a Jewish community in Hebron. Only then were the husbands allowed to rejoin their families here, and eventually the Israeli government rebuilt this entire building, adding on 2 floors, which I'm happy about because I live all the way upstairs there in one of those apartments that was added on. And that was the beginning of the renewal of the Jewish community in Hebron. That's how we came back to Hebron. That's the way it used to be. It used to be where, when the terrorists decided to kill people in the hopes of causing them to leave, the Israeli government would say no, and they would do the exact opposite. They would say, we're going to bring more people to live here. Today it works the other way around. They keep people, kill people, they say, now we have to run away, and they take people away. But then that's the way it was. That's how we came back to Hebron, 1979, 1980, the beginning of the renewal of a Jewish community, a Jewish presence in Hebron. Today down here, the building today is mostly residential. Upstairs people live. We have a little synagogue upstairs also. Downstairs here is a museum. The museum, you'll see why in a minute. It takes a long time to finish this, to work on it. But I'd like to show you a little bit of it. Okay? Those of you that haven't fallen asleep, now I have that button. Floor opens up. Please follow me. I promise you it won't take a long, long time. Come. This room represents Hebron pre-1929. In a few minutes, you'll know why I use 1929 as a watershed date. Many people that come in here, not people like you, but many journalists, and I get all sorts of diplomats from Scandinavia, think that the history of Hebron begins in 1967. Okay? So, no, I'm serious. So I try to show them that there was a Jewish presence in Hebron before then. Okay, and they say, 4,000 years ago, but, so I try to show them that there's something in between. Okay? If we go chronologically, the pictures over here on the right side, okay, of the panel are pictures of a synagogue that was built in Hebron in 1540. I won't go into great detail about it, because maybe I'm not sure if we will go down there or not, but this is a synagogue that was built, named after Abraham, built in 1540. In 1540, Jews who had been exiled from Spain in 1492 and went to Turkey came here, and those Jews and their offspring lived here for almost 400 years. That synagogue was named after Abraham, and those are pictures of that synagogue taken in the early 1900s. Okay? From there, we can go over to the pictures on this panel here. If you're familiar with one of the Jewish Hasidic groups called Chabad Lubavitch, came to Hebron in the early 1800s, and they too were here until the early 1900s, until 1929. One of the important people from that group that was here was a woman who was a granddaughter of the founder of all of that movement. She's buried here in Hebron. Again, we're talking about the early 1800s. Over here again, we're jumping around. This building was built in 1873. It was at the time the largest building in Hebron. It was built by a Jew who came here from Turkey. He wanted a place to rest. This building is today across the street. We've added 3 floors onto it, gone down a floor, and this is where the yeshiva that I mentioned earlier is today located. This is in the 1870s, and we jump from there over here. This is a yeshiva that came from Slobodka in Lithuania in 1924, 1925. They studied in Hebron. This is a class picture from 1928. One of the interesting things that's happened to me giving tours to groups is that a number of years ago, when I had a group in here, there was an older man on the group, and when I finished, he came over here and he said, "Do you see him?" And I said, "Yes," and he said, "That's me." Okay? And then when he finished my tour, he came back and gave us his tour, which was fascinating, much better than mine. In any case, so like I said, I'm not going into all of the details, just to give you a little taste. Again, showing that we're talking about a Jewish community from the 1500s through the 1900s. Didn't start in 1967. Please follow me up here. There's a step up. Please watch your step. This is a memorial room for the people that were killed here in 1929. In order to understand what happened here in Hebron in 1929, we have to go back a few years. One of the questions that I'm also addressed with frequently is the relationship between the Jews and Arabs in Hebron. If we go back to the early 1900s, or we can go back further than that, the relationship between the Jews and the Arabs in Hebron fluctuated, depending on the political realities of the particular day. Of course, Hebron was all of Israel was under the rule of the Ottoman Empire, and the sheikhs that ruled places like Hebron, their decisions were based around whatever political accounting they had with their neighbors and like that. We know that in the early 1900s, the relationship between the Jews and the Arabs in Hebron were positive. There were Arabs who spoke Yiddish and Ladino, and there were Jews who spoke Arabic, and they lived together like neighbors. That relationship started to change in the early 1920s, when the British, who were then ruling in Eretz Yisrael, in the land of Israel, the British had come here, of course, under a mandate from the League of Nations following World War I to establish a national home for the Jewish people here in their homeland. In the early 1920s, the British appointed a man named Amin al-Husseini to be the Mufti of Jerusalem. Amin al-Husseini was a true Jew hater. In the 1930s, he met with Hitler in Berlin, formed the Muslim brigades, and he had plans to annihilate the Jews living here in Israel when they expected Rommel to invade during World War II. During the 1920s, his incitement peaked in the summer of 1929, when they were trying to prevent Jews from reaching the Western Wall in the Old City. On a Thursday, in the middle of August of 1929, 4 Jews came to Hebron from Jerusalem. They belonged to the Haganah, the Jewish Defense Organization. They brought weapons with them. And they said to the Jewish leadership, take these weapons so you can defend yourselves. There are problems. The Mufti is inciting. There might be trouble. The Jewish leadership in Hebron said no. They said, we don't need the weapons. The Arabs are our friends. If we take the weapons, they'll only serve as a provocation. And they sent them back to Jerusalem that same day with the weapons they brought in. This was on Thursday. On Friday, the Mufti sent messengers around Israel saying that the Jews were trying to conquer Temple Mount and that Arab blood was flowing through the streets of Jerusalem. This was, of course, a lie, but it was a green light. It was a signal. The Arabs started rioting. Those rumors hit Hebron in the early afternoon. The Arabs left their prayers, and they too started to riot. Their first stop was the Hibernia Shiva, the pictures of which we saw in the first room. Now, we've got to keep in mind that we're talking about the middle of the summer. A lot of guys were on vacation. It was Friday afternoon. The ones that were here were getting ready for the Sabbath. There was one man sitting in the yeshiva study hall. This man here, the Arabs killed him. And the Jews in Hebron went hysterical. They panicked. They ran to the British officer who was here, a man named Caparata, and he very condescendingly said to them, go home and lock your doors. We'll take care of everything. Having no choice, that's what they did. The next day, the Arabs went house to house, and they literally slaughtered these people. They tortured the men, they raped the women, they did horrible things to them. The British did nothing to stop it. Most of the British police force, primarily Arab, they participated. The officer did nothing to stop it. This went on for a period of 2.5, 3 hours, during which time period 67 people were killed and another 70 were wounded. The survivors, how did it end? The officer sitting on a horse saw a mob coming towards him. They had just killed 2 brothers. He saw them walking in his direction. He was afraid that they were going to attack him. He took out his gun, shot a few times in the air. The Arabs heard the gunshots and they stopped. But that was too late to save the people that had been killed. The survivors were taken to the big building I showed you in the previous room, where today the yeshiva is, the building that had been built in the 1870s. They had confiscated it and were using it as a police station. They took the survivors, left them on the basement floor for 3 days, giving them nothing, no food, no drink, leaving them as they were. On the 3rd day, they brought in buses and trucks, shipped them all out to Jerusalem, and that was basically the end of the Jewish community of Hebron. A man that I know who lives in Chicago, who was a little boy then, his father, he told me his father wrote to the British High Commissioner and asked him, why did you punish the victims? We were the ones who were the victims and then we were expelled. Why did you throw us out? And the answer that he received back was that there were more of them than there were of you, and you couldn't continue to live together, so it was just easier to get rid of you than it was to get rid of them. Okay? And that was the end of the community, basically a community that had been here continuously for literally hundreds and thousands of years. A small group came back in 1931. They were here until 1936. In the spring of 1936, again after the Passover holidays, the British started knocking on doors in the middle of the night. They said, the Mufti's inciting, we can't protect you, and they took them as they were, put them on the buses, sent them to Jerusalem, and that was the end of a community until we came back here in 1967. Behind me are the stones from the cemetery that, as we found when we came back in 1967, the cemetery had been destroyed. They had a vegetable patch there and a shack. These are pictures of all of the people that were killed, the rabbis of Hebron, men, women, and children. This man here was the leader of the community, and he knew all the Arabs because he was the only Jew on the Hebron Municipal Council. And he went to people's houses on Friday night and Saturday morning, and he said, if you're scared, come to my house. I know them all. You'll be safe by me. As a result, there were dozens of people there. The Arabs showed up outside his house. They called up to him and said, if you'll give us all of the strangers in the house, we'll leave you and your family alone. He yelled back, there are no strangers here. It's all my family. The Arabs broke in. They came in through the roof of his house. They killed him, his son, his wife. His wife's parents were in Hebron for a family holiday. Her father was the rabbi of another city in Hebron, in Israel, Zichron Yaakov. The only one left of his immediate family is the little boy, the third up on the left, behind you over there, who was a year old at the time. He was badly hurt and survived. He lives today in Ra'anana and comes frequently to visit us. You can still see the scar on his forehead where he was hurt then. These are pictures that were taken in the hospitals in Jerusalem. These are some of the easier pictures to look at. There are pictures that are much more difficult to look at. In back of us over here, some of the homes in the synagogues. The picture on the top left with a picture of Herzl in there is the family, is the home where this this man lived that I told you about, and the synagogues. This is what happened here in the space of a few hours in August of 1929. I used to bring people in here, particularly journalists, and show them this and try to explain to them why we opposed the Oslo Accords. And they said, but things have changed. It's not the same anymore. You have to give peace a chance. Okay? Since Israel gave peace a chance with the Oslo Accords signed back in 1993, 1994, there have been about 2,000 Israelis killed in terrorist attacks and tens of thousands wounded and maimed. Okay? Nothing has changed. But that's not true. Then they could only kill one at a time. Today they can get on a bus with a bomb, blow themselves up, and kill 20 or 30 at a time. Other than that, nothing has changed. If Israel has to be able to be self-dependent, we cannot depend on anybody else for our security. Our security, of course, starts from above. Okay? But after that, God doesn't expect us to sit home and say, okay, He'll protect us. Okay? We've got to be able to deal with ourselves. If we put our security in the hands of our enemies, then this is the result. Okay? And we've done it time and time again. We try to express that to people. Of course, terrorism all over the world is battled except in Israel. In Israel, you can't battle terrorism. You're expected to acquiesce to that terrorism. However, we know that the fight against terrorism in Israel is not only for ourselves. We know that today, standing behind that terrorism are the same kind of people that blew up the Twin Towers in New York and went to Spain and went to London and are trying to get to other places. And we know that if we acquiesce to terror here, it's going to boomerang and it's going to hit you people back in the States, because the terrorists are going to say, look, we managed to force them over there to do what we want. We can do the same thing all over the world, and that's what we have to prevent. If we can stop it here, then maybe we'll be able to stop it in Europe and in the United States. If we let it unravel here, then for sure it's going to continue to boomerang and hit people all over the world. And when I've been in the States, I used to go up to Washington, up to the Hill, and talk to the representatives and said, you have to try to stop the terrorism in Israel, not for us, but for you. Okay? And a lot of those people understand it. The problem is the people that don't understand it are ruling the state of Israel. Okay? And those are the ones we have to take care of. But you people also. You people have to make sure that your representatives in Congress and in the Senate understand and know that a place like Hebron is important. It's important for religious reasons, it's important for nationalistic reasons, and it's important for security reasons. Okay? And if they know that it's important to you, then as politicians go, it'll be important to them too. And I can tell you that I've met people, and I know that it's important to them because for the same significance that it's important to me, not only political.